Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Timothy Hampton. I'm the director of the Doreen B. Townsend Center for the Humanities at the University of California at Berkeley. Welcome to today's Berkeley Book Chat. The Berkeley Book Chats feature a member of the UC Berkeley Arts and Humanities faculty discussing a recent work with a colleague. Today, we're very happy to welcome Professor Edward Tyerman of the Department of Slavic Languages and Literatures, talking about his new book, Internationalist Aesthetics, China and Early Soviet Culture. He'll be in conversation with Professor Andrew Jones of East Asian Languages and Literatures. It's a particular pleasure to welcome Professor Tyerman back to the Townsend Center, as he was one of our faculty fellows year before last, during the time when he was completing the manuscript of his book. Before I turn things over to our guests, let me say a word about upcoming events. Next week, we'll be welcoming Professor Sansan Kwan of Theater, Dance, and Performance Studies to talk about her new book, Love Dances, Loss and Mourning in Intercultural Collaboration. Because we're talking about China partly today, I also want to alert you to the three-part series that we are sponsoring beginning on March 2nd. For 3 Wednesday events under the general title In Dialogue with China, Art, Culture, and Politics. And I remind all of you grant seekers out there that the day after tomorrow, February 11th, we will be co-sponsoring an event with Margaret Guerrero and David Siegfried of Foundation Relations and Corporate Philanthropy on the Berkeley campus on how to get grants for the support of research in the humanities. They do exist, and they'll tell you how to find them. So that will be noon on February 11th. Feel free to consult our website for a full calendar of events sponsored by the Townsend Center. As we turn to today's event, let me remind you that our guests will speak for about 3/4 of an hour, and then the floor will be open to questions from the audience. So please use your chat function to transmit your questions. Now it's my great pleasure to turn things over to Edward and Andrew. Welcome to the Townsend Center.
Thank you. It's great to be here. I'll start with a few comments about Edward's marvelous book. It was really a pleasure to be able to read it, and I'm delighted to be here to talk with him about the book. So early on in the book, International Aesthetics, China and Early Soviet Culture, Edward makes a fairly ringing statement of what he means by at least the aspiration of internationalist aesthetics. And here's the quotation. This is on page 7. "This is the aspiration of what I call internationalist aesthetics, to render the world knowable as the site of global struggle against capital, and to create a new kind of political subject with horizontal affinities across the lines of nation, race, and culture." And what I think the book renders knowable for us as readers is a very intense moment of engagement between Soviet culture and Soviet intellectuals and activists and China, in a moment when knowing China and becoming known by China, perhaps, is of the essence of both cultural movements as well as political movements. So reading through the book, I felt that it's rich and significant because it makes that moment, which not a lot of us know about, visible for the first time. And it also ranges across many different media. We hear about poetics. We hear about cinema, including films that were made and also films that weren't made, but one hopes had been made. We can return to that in a little while. We hear about drama of various sorts. We hear about biographical novels. We hear about factographic literature. And with all of these genres, Edward provides really beautiful and supple close readings of various different kinds of media and places them against a vibrant and sharply etched historical background of the exchange or networks that are developed between China and Russia in a quite determinate historical period. And in that sense, I think the book really performs what it's about, or it reenacts what it's about, which is making connections. It's about making connections across disparate realms of linguistic, disciplinary, media realms, and also it's about the connections that were forged in that period between intellectuals and friends, and also connections that didn't take place or connections that broke because of historical contingencies. And throughout, I think one of the master tropes of the book is really about travel and movement, whether it's travel effected by media such as cinema or actual travel, moving across the fairly vast geographical spaces that separate Moscow from Beijing or Shanghai. So I wanted to start the conversation by actually asking Edward to talk about a couple bookends, stories, anecdotes that begin the book with connection and end the book with perhaps a gesture towards disconnection, but also perhaps a more enduring connection between socialist cultures in China and Russia. So, Edward, maybe you can tell us a little bit about Mayakovsky and his best verse as a sort of trope for mediatized travel, and then we'll talk about the Gobi Desert in the end of the book.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much, Angie, for this very kind introduction. Thank you for being part of this conversation. It's a real pleasure to be in dialogue with you. And thank you to Tim and to the Townsend Center for hosting this. So yeah, I begin the book with the story of a poem by Vladimir Mayakovsky, one of the most prominent early Soviet poets, and it's a poem called "The Best Verse." And in it, Mayakovsky recounts in verse something that happened to him at a recent reading in the Russian town of Yaroslavl, where he was asked to read his best poem. And while he's thinking about what to read, somebody comes and hands him a note, which is a record of a telegram announcing that, as he puts it in the poem, the workers and soldiers of Canton had taken Shanghai. And in response to this poem that is not a poem, right, that is simply the reading out of a reported fact, there's this enormous burst of applause that takes place in the audience. Mayakovsky describes this applause crossing Eurasian space and participating in this conflict that is taking place in Shanghai. The applause itself becomes a kind of symbol of this ideal of transnational worker solidarity that he wants to affirm. And he ends by essentially saying that, and maybe I'll read out the section where he addresses this, I will not equate all that poetic slush, so his own poetic writing, any of the greatest poetic glories, I will not equate them to the simple newspaper fact, if Yaroslavl applauds it thus. Oh, is there an attachment of greater power than the solidarity that molds the workers' hive? So this was something I came across quite early in the work on the book, and I was struck by it simply because here is Mayakovsky, maybe the most famous early Soviet poet, claiming that his best verse is not a verse at all, but a simple newspaper fact, and that it's to do with political events taking place in Shanghai, in contemporary China. The poem was written in March 1927. So for those that have a sense of Chinese history, and we can talk a little bit more about what the exact historical context for this is, but this is a moment when a nationalist army organized with the assistance of Soviet advisors is marching north from Guangzhou in the south to attempt to reunify China and take China under its control. China this time is divided between rival military factions. The north and south are politically split. And so I was struck by the fact that Mayakovsky presents this moment in March 1927 as the crucial event, not just in the politics of China, but in some way in Soviet life as well, right? Mm-hmm. And that there is this intense awareness of what's going on in China in the mid-1920s, which when I began working on the book, I wasn't so familiar with. And I think partly that's the untold story that the book itself is trying to tease out. But the other question here is the question of the newspaper fact itself. And that's where I think this poem serves as a kind of starting point for this discussion of what I call internationalist aesthetics in the book, because consistently the kinds of forms that my Soviet writers and filmmakers are interested in using in order to capture contemporary China and connect their own audiences to what's happening in China are predominantly documentary forms, or they're forms that in some way are linked to the possibility of fixing that relationship as something that's really happening in the immediate present. So the crossing of space is really important here, but also an achievement of a kind of simultaneity, I guess I would say, that the speed of a reported fact traveling by telegraph from Shanghai to Yaroslavl in European Russia is then able to be immediately paralleled by this sort of imagined journey of this sort of sonic expression of Soviet solidarity traveling back to China.
Right. And what's remarkable about the moment is also that somehow a newspaper fact made into a poem can create a community of feeling across space. So that poem was written in 1927, really at the high point of this intense engagement of Soviet intellectuals with the Chinese Revolution. And of course, fairly soon after, the situation changes quite a lot. And that's one reason that the book largely centers on a brief but very intense efflorescence of interest in China in the 1920s. What happens after that, or what are some of the factors that lead to disconnection, as opposed to the creation of a proletarian community of feeling across borders?
That's a great question, and it's true that to a certain extent, the project that I'm describing, which is broadly speaking, an attempt to use new forms of art, new forms of literature, cinema, drama in particular, to create this sense of transnational, of internationalist community between Soviet and Chinese subjects. Project that, as I think I put it at one point in the introduction, is haunted by the shadow of failure, right? So I'm not trying to give some utopian sense of early Soviet culture as entirely consumed by this internationalist perspective. But there is this particular moment in the 1920s where I think Soviet hopes both for a political revolution and for a kind of cultural production that could create this sense of internationalist community are focused very intensively on China. And this is to do with the fact that the Communist International in the mid-1920s is seeking possible sites of revolution to follow the Russian Revolution. So the idea was always that the Russian Revolution would lead to further proletarian revolutions in Europe. When that doesn't happen, there's this turn towards Asia as the possible site for revolution, which means a turn towards anti-imperial, anti-colonial revolutions, right? So the Comintern's investment in China at this time is partly to do with the fact that China at that time has a significant presence of foreign powers, foreign concessions, the operations of foreign capital within China. These are all things that the Comintern hopes a national revolution will overthrow. So they orchestrate this alliance between the Chinese Communist Party and the Chinese Nationalist Party and send advisors to China to engage in training a Kuomintang army for the nationalists. And this is the alliance that essentially falls apart about a month after Mayakovsky writes his poem, when the nationalists under Chiang Kai-shek, having taken Shanghai, then turn against the communists, kill a lot of communist activists and workers, imprison hundreds more, and drive the Soviet advisors out of the country. So what happens after that is an interesting kind of disjuncture, I would say. So China doesn't really disappear from the Soviet imagination because it remains a strategically important space, but it becomes less prominent in terms of Soviet art and Soviet culture. And this is partly for the practical reason, I think, that less of these Soviet artists and intellectuals are able to actually travel to China once that hostile relationship with the nationalists kicks in. So a lot of the people that I talk about in the book, particularly this figure Sergei Tretyakov, who's a central figure, were able to spend time in China in the mid-1920s and use that experience to perform this kind of mediation of China for a Soviet republic. What does happen in the 30s, which I get to a little bit in the epilogue to the book, is that other kinds of mediation get foregrounded instead. So actually in the 30s, you see a much more intensive process of translating contemporary Chinese literature into Russian, published in the journal International Literature. So writers like Lu Shun, Mao Dun, Roche, and other sort of contemporary Chinese prose writers are being translated and published in that journal. And figures like the poet Xiao San, known in Russian as Emi Xiao, are writing poems for the journal that are sort of translated from his own Chinese and trying to kind of actively mediate the relationship between China and Soviet Russia in a different way. And actually, this is a moment when Soviet culture is becoming more prominent within China itself, right? So there's a sort of an intensive Chinese engagement with Soviet cinema that really begins in the early 1930s. There's more translations of contemporary Soviet literature taking place in China. So the two trends slightly miss each other, I would say, which is one of the kind of one of the failed connections that I talk about a little bit in the epilogue.
Right. There's a lovely anecdote at the end in the wake of the failure, in the wake of the massacre, actually, of many communists by the Chinese Nationalist Party that the Soviets had allied with before 1927. There's a sort of exodus of many Soviet intellectuals out of the country. And one in particular, Oscar Tarkhanov, who ends up writing a series of fictional works about China, conveys this story that Edward talks about of driving across the Gobi Desert from China back to the Soviet Union. And in the process, stopping to commemorate a dead comrade, a French communist, and then running into a caravan of Chinese students who are returning from a university set up to educate people from the Orient, from the East, on their way back into China. And that encounter seems particularly plangent. I wonder if you could address that a little bit.
Yeah, right. It sort of forms a counterpoint to the optimistic story of connection that we have with Mayakovsky in the beginning, right? With this kind of collective applause traveling to Shanghai. So in the summer of 1927, the main Soviet advisor in China, a guy called Mikhail Baradin, flees the country to avoid arrest by the nationalists. And the only way out is through the Gobi Desert. And the only way through the Gobi Desert at that time is by car. There's not yet a railway. So he and several of his advisors and a few writers, an American journalist, Anna Louise Strong, was also part of this group. The son of the nationalist foreign minister, Eugene Chen, Percy Chen, was also in this group, are driving through the Gobi Desert in a caravan of cars, essentially. Baradin has a broken arm. The whole thing has this kind of sort of adventurous, but also somewhat mournful quality to it. And so Razumov, who was, his real name was, his real name was Razumov, yes. All of these guys, because all these Comintern agents had multiple different pseudonyms. So his name was Tarkhanov, but his real name was Razumov, but he published under the name of Erdberg. He was a communist activist who had been working with Baradin in Guangzhou, and also an aspiring writer who documented this journey and his various different journeys around China in a book called Chinese Novellas. And he describes this journey as having this kind of emotional high point when one of the companions, a French communist called Adolphe, is killed in an accident with one of the cars, and they bury him in the middle of the desert. And this becomes a sort of symbolic mourning for the history of the Comintern, of sort of international socialism as a history of failures, of defeats, of this ongoing process of revolutions thwarted. But at the very moment when they finish burying him, they see a caravan coming the other way, and it's a group of students coming back from the Communist University for the Workers of the East, which is one of these universities that was set up in Moscow to specifically train students from both the countries of the Soviet East, as we might call it, so Central Asia and the Caucasus, and also countries of the external East, so places like Iran, Turkey, and particularly China. So there's a group of students coming back the other way, and they encounter this sort of mournful scene. One of them takes off their red scarf and ties it to the monument they've placed above Adolf's grave. So this becomes a kind of, I phrase it as a kind of passing of the baton in a way, that this is a moment which Tarkhanov is trying to present as the defeated Soviet advisors handing over responsibility for the Chinese Revolution to these Soviet-trained students who are now coming back to continue that work within China. So it's an attempt to kind of snatch a future victory from the jaws of a current defeat, I suppose. And quite likely that the entire account is highly embellished. I mean, other people who wrote about the trip, Percy Chen suggests they actually buried Adolf in Ulaanbaatar, not in the middle of the desert. And Louise Strong suggests that the students were more kind of terrified about going back to a China in which nationalists were massacring communists than they were inspired about the revolutionary future.
Right. It's like a very cinematic moment in my reading. There's a detail of a red scarf being taken off the neck of one of these returning students and laid in tribute to the dead communists in the desert. It has a kind of a sense of rendering visible a certain kind of solidarity or passing of the baton, as you said. And I wanted to take up that question because a lot of what you say about Chechikov's work, and maybe you can also introduce him to us as a historical figure, has to do with his various efforts to make China visible, to make China audible, to make China palpable, and to make solidarity something that can come into presence in simultaneity for Soviet citizens who watch or listen to his various productions. And he worked across many different media. This is a fascinating thing about this figure. He works in cinema, poetry, biographical fiction, and musical drama. And it seemed to me in the process of reading the book that he's almost toggling between different media in an effort to come up with a more effective aesthetic, or to come up with more perceptual modes of making these connections between international proletariat movements. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about Chechikov and about media and the role of different media in the book.
Sure, absolutely. I don't know how visible this is, but this is Sergei Tretьякov. It's a picture of him in Beijing in, I think, 1925. This is the cover of the book. He's an interesting figure to me because he's someone who has received less attention, particularly in Western scholarship, than a lot of his more famous colleagues and comrades. So he was a member of this kind of early Soviet avant-garde movement that also included people like Sergei Eisenstein, Dziga Vertov, Alexander Rodchenko. He was close friends with Bertolt Brecht. His writing influenced Walter Benjamin's writing about the artist as producer. A lot of the ideas in there are taken from Chechikov. But he's had a little bit less exposure, I think, than these other figures. Even though, as I try to suggest in the book, I think in many ways he's a pivotal figure, particularly for his investment in this question of how a revolutionary culture should also in some way be an internationalist culture and how that should work. So Tretьякov began his literary career as a poet, as a futurist poet, a member of this kind of radical avant-garde group that were trying to create entirely new poetic forms, including forms of language that were transrational in some way, or working heavily with the sound and texture of poetry. Mm-hmm. But he also began his work as a poet in Vladivostok, which is also important. So he, in the very far east of Russia, which was a city in Russia that, among other things, had a sizable Chinese migrant population. So he's in Vladivostok during the Civil War. He leaves there when the Japanese invade Vladivostok during the Civil War. He travels to China for the first time in around 1921, writes a few poems about his trip through Beijing at that point, and then comes back to Moscow, where he gets involved in the kind of rising tide of avant-garde experimental culture, starts working with Eisenstein, works with Vsevolod Meyerhold, who's probably the most important kind of avant-garde director of the period. And then he's sent to China in 1924 to teach Russian in the Russian department at Beijing University, pretty much explicitly as a kind of a cultural diplomat whose job there is to both strengthen ties between the university, the Soviet embassy, and Moscow. So a lot of the students who are studying Russian at that time will go on to study at some of these universities that are set up in Moscow specifically for Chinese students. But he's also there to work as a journalist. So he writes a huge number of articles for Pravda, for multiple different Soviet journals at the time, where he's trying to convey to the Soviet public what is happening in China and the sort of urgency of China's contemporary revolutionary moment, right? So he's there he's there for the death of Sun Yat-sen in March 1925. He's there for the March 30th incident in 1925 when a large number of protesters are shot in Shanghai by British police, launching a large-scale process of protests and strikes across China that then fuels what's sometimes called the National Revolution, right, of 1925 to 27 that culminates in this taking of Shanghai. And he's trying to convey all of this to a Soviet public who historically have a fairly limited sense of what is actually happening in China, and as he's particularly keen to point out, what sense they do have tends to get processed through exotic stereotypes and cultural forms that are actually coming from the West. So one of his major projects is really to find ways of overcoming exoticism, which he understands through this Marxist lens as a kind of commodity fetishism, I would say, that turns China and the Chinese into these kind of objects of aesthetic fascination, fundamentally rather than thinking of them as commendable political subjects experiencing a similar revolutionary modernity to the one that Russia itself was experiencing. And I think that shift is the project that Chechikov is really interested in. You're absolutely right, though, that the way he goes about it is this kind of search. So he's looking for a method and actually a medium by which this process of connecting the Soviet public to China and to its contemporary reality could be achieved. And he goes through multiple different variations of what that medium might be. So when he first gets to Beijing, for example, he writes poetry. He writes this very interesting experimental poem called Raw China, which is an attempt to use onomatopoeia to capture the sounds of the sort of street vendors and peddlers of the Beijing streets and convey them in Russian verse. So he tries to use sort of particular kind of sonic combinations or particular Russian roots that could capture these very distinctive sounds that the various street traders of Beijing would use to describe their particular trade, right? So the barber has one sound, I think it's made by blowing into a long trumpet. The water seller has a sound that's made by the squeaking sound of his cart. And Chechikov is trying to find ways of conveying all this in poetry. So it's an interesting attempt for me to sort of use poetry almost as a documentary medium, right? That can sort of convey the immediate experience of what for Soviet readers would be a strange sonic foreign soundscape. Right. Then he moves in, he writes a lot of journalism, trying to use the kind of short form of the article as a way of just giving these fragmented snapshots of what's happening in China. He also goes into theater. He writes a series of screenplays for a film that Eisenstein was supposed to make but never actually ended up making. And yeah, I agree that it's really this testing out of what these different media can achieve, right? In the case of theater, I think his experiment is particularly interesting. There, he writes a play which is also called Raw China, which goes on to have a kind of remarkable international career. It gets performed.
I was curious to hear. I think people would be interested in hearing more about the contrast that you draw between Raw China and The Red Poppy, which becomes a rather big hit in the Soviet Union, but doesn't travel internationally like Raw China does.
Right. So yeah, Raw China is again a documentary play. It's about an event that happened in the town of Wanxian in Sichuan in 1923, I believe. when there was an altercation between an American businessman and some Chinese boatmen about the rights to trade on the Yangtze. And as a result, the American businessman ends up drowned. And in retaliation, a local, a sort of nearby commander of a nearby British warship orders that two of the boatmen should be executed in compensation for this death. And Chechikov stages this as a kind of parable of the larger experience of China under conditions of semi-colonial domination. What's interesting there is the way that he uses different levels of language to capture both the fact that this is a situation taking place across a linguistic divide. So his characters speak Russian, but when they speak to each other, the Chinese characters speak Chinese Pidgin Russian, which is actually a trade language which developed in northern China along the Russian border for interactions between Russians and Chinese. And he also draws attention to the fact that in some ways this dynamic of sort of different languages is artificial, right? So at times the Chinese characters will respond in Chinese, at times they will speak in Chinese Pidgin Russian, at times they will speak Russian. And what's interesting to me there is that in the theater, I think he's playing with this tension between theater as something that depends on the presence of the audience and the actors together in the same space, and the way that he's trying to convey a foreign reality on a stage in Moscow. And so in a sense, he makes the translation deliberately imperfect to draw attention to the way there has been a translation of this foreign reality onto this stage, right? The artificiality of what's happening has to somehow remain in the audience's mind, even as they are drawn into the struggle of these characters. It's similar in a way to some things that Brecht does in his own theatre.
Right. This was actually throughout the book, there's a lot of very close and productive attention to the issue of translation itself. On the one hand, often these texts about China do route their sense of revolutionary virtue or revolutionary praxis through Moscow. And in the formal sense, often Chinese texts or Chinese stories are routed through Russian, but they're also imprinting or changing the nature of the Russian language, as you just brought out so clearly in the account of Ruhr China. This is very, very interesting because, of course, at the same time, there's an intense program of translation into Chinese of Russian literature. And arguably, that kind of intense saturation of the Chinese discursive field of Russian literary works in translation also is perhaps one of the most formative aspects of the development of modern Chinese literature. So I think I really appreciated the attention to translation and even the very close details of the way in which the Russian language is used to distort Chinese, but also to upend readers or theatergoers' perceptions of what China is or what China means. Yeah.
Right, absolutely. And I do spend a lot of time talking about translation in the book, both in terms of the granular practice and the sort of the wider, I suppose, power dynamics that are involved in translation. So there's often this tension between translations that foreground the fact that translation has taken place, right? That retain the sense that this is a translation of a foreign context that has its own linguistic and cultural norms, and translations that tend to erase that. So actually, in terms of the relationship between Ruhr China and The Red Poppy, which is the other major theatrical production I talk about, The Red Poppy is a very large-scale production. It's the first ballet to be staged in the Soviet Union that was really considered to be a Soviet ballet. So a ballet on contemporary themes, a ballet that deals with revolution, not part of the older ballet archive, but doing something tangibly new. And traditionally ballets, 19th century ballets aren't set in the present, right? Ballet is a genre that tends to draw on sort of folkloric, historical, mythical tales from deep history. But this is a ballet that's set in China in the mid-1920s. And it's staged for the 10-year anniversary of the October Revolution in 1927. So it's really in a sense, gives a sense of how China became really central to this moment of taking stock of what the revolution means in the Soviet Union in the mid-1920s. But there, this process of sort of translating China into Soviet culture takes a very different form. And the central image of the ballet is chosen as this red flower, the red poppy, which is passed around between a Chinese dancer and this Soviet naval captain, who she falls in love with. It's a sort of strange restaging of Madame Butterfly, in a way, for revolutionary China. When Chinese spectators saw the ballet, it's actually during Mao's visit to Moscow in 1949, 1950, they launched an aggressive protest against it, because they insisted that for them, this red poppy was a symbol of opium, and thus a symbol of the opium wars of the 19th century, which were associated for them, obviously, with the imperialist subjugation of China. And so one of the questions that interested me there was, how did this Soviet production team, who were making a ballet, a sort of anti-imperialist ballet about China in the 20s, and the ballet is about how the Soviet captain is trying to defeat the power of the British in this port, which is implicitly Shanghai. How did they end up choosing this symbol, which in a Chinese context had immediately negative associations they didn't seem to be aware of? And there, I think you see this kind of the limitations of some forms of translation, that their own associations of the flower with redness and with a kind of sunny optimism that the poppy has more readily symbolic associations with within Russian culture, basically sort of drowned out any possibility of seeing it as a symbol that would signify within China. So that's really a kind of constant pull, to and fro pull, that I see running through the book, between this investment in presenting China as existing in the same revolutionary present, as having its own kind of forms of turbulent revolutionary culture that are developing along their own historical trajectories, and a tendency to foreground sort of Soviet primacy and the Soviet narrative of history as the hegemonic narrative for everybody.
Right. And another thing that fascinated me about that is it seems like, in the case of a play like The Red Poppy, it's not only an effort to create a new revolutionary ballet, but it's still somehow shadowed by Western operatic traditions, Puccini and the like, as well as perhaps the Hollywood musical. One of the ironies of the kind of absorption of montage aesthetics, for instance, in Chinese cinema in the early 30s, is that it comes in part from screenings of Eisenstein that you mentioned in your book, but also in part through another circuit, which we could call that of, the vernacular modernism, to use Miriam Hansen's term, of globalized Hollywood cinema. So, for instance, in China, the song of the Volga Boatmen kind of reaches China not through the Soviet Union, but through Cecil B. DeMille's film, and then becomes a motif for many leftist filmmakers as well as musicians in the early 30s. So I'm wondering, actually, the extent to which the fact that there is a kind of global dominance of Hollywood in China becomes a pressure against which people like Chechikov are pushing. Another instance of this is, you mentioned travelogue films that stage, for instance, aviation expeditions between the Soviet Union to China, and they're filmed into kind of expedition films. And it seemed to me that you at least imply that they're also a little bit shadowed by Hollywood film genres that work in the travelogue form, or that even stage the exploration of Africa or other sort of global places in the global South. So I wonder if you could address the way in which Chechikov is trying to resist, but he and his colleagues are trying to resist, but are often sometimes drawn back into the orbit of Hollywood or the West, as it were.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And I have a whole chapter on cinema, where I think this becomes particularly acute, because Soviet cinema in the 1920s is seeking to develop its own autonomous forms, and particularly the Soviet school of montage, which develops at that time. People like Eisenstein, Pudovkin, Bertov, is trying to position itself as doing something distinctively revolutionary with the form of cinematic montage. At the same time, they're getting a lot of their ideas about how montage works from Hollywood cinema, right? Particularly from D.W. Griffith, who Eisenstein constantly cited as one of his major influences. And they're operating in a context in the Soviet 20s when actually Hollywood cinema remains widely accessible and actually in many ways more popular than these sort of more formally radical films that Soviet filmmakers are making. So, for example, the most popular film in 1925 was The Thief of Baghdad, starring Douglas Fairbanks, right? which far went to see, and they went to see Battleship Potemkin. And so when they turn to China, there's actually this, one of the things I'd look at in the film chapter is that cinema is understood as a medium that allows for a certain kind of connection, that allows for this kind of registration of facts by the camera that then can be transferred across distance to connect this, to connect a viewing audience in Moscow to events that are happening in Shanghai. Chechikov describes cinema as being able to create a face-to-face encounter with these Chinese comrades, which in some ways I think is sort of facing the complexity of how the apparatus actually works, but is certainly the aspiration going on there. At the same time, there's clearly a very concerted interest in the Soviet film world in creating films that could actually be exported to China and seen by Chinese audiences. And there they're really thinking about themselves, again, as competing with Hollywood cinema and its domination within China itself.
Right.
So when Chechikov puts together this 3-part trilogy of films that Eisenstein is going to hopefully direct, which never happened, which is very sad to me, it would have been a much richer book if they had made these 3 films. But they're constantly thinking about how will these work for a Chinese audience, right? How are we going to make films that not only will inform the Soviet Union about China, but will, in a sense, present Chinese spectators with their own reality as sort of mediated through this Soviet cinematic gaze. And they're absolutely interested in using the kind of effective power of montage, which you already see in Hollywood cinema, and finding a way to kind of match it while also filling it with a different kind of ideological content.
Right. So that's fascinating. So we are having some questions coming in from the audience, so we can, I think, shift into Q&A. And I welcome everyone, of course, to write your questions in the chat box, and I will convey them to Edward. So we were just talking about cinema. There's a question that's come in about music, which asks, could you talk a bit more about the musical exchanges between the two countries? Music seems to be one of the art forms that would offer the greatest challenges, with Russian music having been so linked to a European tradition. I'll just preface Edward's answer by saying that there's a really consistent attention to auditory phenomena in the book, especially in his close readings of The Red Poppy, Roar China, and the way that auditory effects were used also in the poetry of Chechikov. But perhaps you can also address music.
Well, that's a great question. Thank you. And you're absolutely right that in a sense it's one of the challenges. It's a sort of microcosm of this larger challenge that these subjects identify, which is essentially we're trying to create a sense of solidarity and common purpose with a space which has been coded for us as culturally other to some extent, right? And it's that attempt to kind of overcome a kind of Eurocentric cultural mindset that I think is at the center of a lot of what these experiments in internationalist aesthetics are about. And if you look at Soviet travelogues about China from the 1920s, a lot of them still have this sort of fairly standardized traveler's scene of encountering something like Chinese musical theater, like Beijing opera, for example, where they will describe this music as sort of nightmarish and cacophonous and alienating. So even there, they're setting up this problem of a particular form as expressing the limits of this sort of sensory engagement. Chechikov himself does a few things in this regard. One, as I said, is instead of capturing sort of instrumental music, he's interested in capturing the sounds of these street peddlers as a kind of music, as a kind of auditory experience, which is both alien and in some way translatable into the forms of Russian poetry. but also when he staged the play Raw China. And here my information is limited by the sources I have, but there was a lot of music in the play, although some of its precise forms are hard to establish. But there was somebody at the side of the stage who played huqin, the Chinese stringed instrument, at key moments in the play, particularly key moments where the Chinese workers in the play are coming to a sense of their kind of collective identity and their need to sort of sacrifice two of their number in order to preserve their own collective future. There was also a song in that play, which is sung by one of the characters, this character whose name is the Boy, who's actually played by a female actor, Maria Babanova. And at a climactic moment in the play, the boy, who's a servant on the English ship, commits suicide and sang a song which all of the critics mention as the most sort of powerful and touching moment in the play. And Babanova's biography mentions that she and Chechikov learned this song from Chinese students who were in Moscow at the time. Unfortunately, I haven't been able to track down what the song is, which would be wonderful. But it is an interesting moment to me of actually deliberately trying to introduce kind of unfiltered a piece of Chinese music into the stage space of a theatrical performance in Moscow. The Red Poppy is somewhat different because there you have a kind of highly stylized version of Chinese music, which is basically various riffs on a pentatonic scale that give a kind of flavor or atmosphere of Chineseness, but can't really be actively linked to, I think, any particular Chinese models. So there you're operating more, I would say, in the genre of a kind of musical chinoiserie or something like that.
Right. This is quite interesting to me because beginning in the early 30s, of course, Soviet revolutionary music becomes really central to the development of revolutionary music in China and becomes the model for the Chinese national anthem. As early as 1921, I think the Internationale is introduced into China and becomes really very much part of the soundtrack of everyday life after the 1949 Chinese Revolution. And yet, Chechikov's Raw China, it's the facticity and the folksiness of that huqin that kind of purchases a sense of affective involvement with the Chinese people. And that leads us maybe to some of the points that you make about national form in the book and the way that national form is both a conduit between China and Russia and also perhaps one of those places that introduces disconnections.
Right. Absolutely. So this idea of national form, which again becomes more established in the 1930s, I would say. It's a famous statement by Joseph Stalin that Soviet culture should be national in form, socialist in content. It's a way of solving the problem of having a multinational, multi-ethnic polity, which is supposed to share the same fundamental socialist culture. So it's applied within the Soviet Union to describe the development of, say, an Armenian socialist culture, a Turkmen socialist culture, a Kazakh socialist culture, and so forth, that they retain elements of their national traditions, which are now sort of codified as national form, but that the content of art is increasingly sort of homogenized around an understanding of correct socialist content. And I think it's true that when there is a turn to including China within this model, it often is through appeals to things like folk forms. So that's true in Raw China. It's true also of the poetry of Xiao San in the 1930s. The poems he writes for this Russian journal, International Literature, are often based on folk songs which he's adapting to revolutionary content. And I think that's also a debate that plays out to some extent within China itself, right? That in spaces like the League of left-wing writers and figures like Xiao San and Chu Qiubai in the 1930s are also having this conversation about what is the role of national forms or of inherited popular forms that can appeal, particularly in China, to a larger rural social base and translate revolutionary ideas into popular forms that can reach a larger rural audience. So in a sense, I think that's actually a conversation that's happening on both sides of the Sino-Soviet exchange, and they're mutually reinforcing each other, right? Chechikov also spent time in Moscow in the early 1920s.
Absolutely. So there's a question that kind of moves us towards unpacking what happens afterwards, which is a question that asks if you can compare the reception of China in the Soviet Union in the 1920s with that in the early 1950s, prior to the Sino-Soviet split. And I think this question also speaks to, the larger question of what's the legacy of this intense period of interaction later on.
Yeah, no, that's a great question, and actually something that I'm increasingly interested in looking into in my current work. So I end the book with, again, a slightly mournful moment where I register the fact that a large number of the people that I talk about over the course of the book lose their lives in the Stalinist purges in the late 1930s. So Chechikov himself is executed in 1937, and a lot of these figures are being arrested in part because of their connection to China in the 1920s. So Chechikov, for example, was executed on charges of being a Japanese spy, right? So this is a moment in the 1930s where the Soviet rivalry with Japan, which is in the process of invading China, is becoming increasingly intense and politically critical. A similar thing happens to the writer Boris Pilniak, whose travelogue to China I also talk about in the first chapter of the book. Several of the major Soviet advisors who go to China in the 30s are also imprisoned or executed. So the generation that are at the center of this internationalist aesthetic experiment in the 20s is largely lost by the time you reach the 1950s, although not entirely. I end with discussing this figure, Vladimir Schneiderov, who was the director of one of the very first Soviet expedition films in 1925, which is called The Great Flight, and is about an aviation expedition from Moscow to Beijing. He went, I think he himself was 24 or 25 years old when he went. He goes back to China in the 1950s to make a co-produced Sino-Soviet film through Western Xinjiang and follows to a planned railway from Kazakhstan into China to Lanzhou. So with Schneider's project, you see that actually a lot of these same themes from the 20s, these questions of connection in particular, of how to link up these two ends of a socialist Eurasian continent, they are getting picked up in the 1950s and reimagined for a moment when China and Russia are both now socialist countries within a greatly expanded socialist world, right? Where you have a kind of socialist Eurasia that stretches from Eastern Europe all the way to China, North Korea, and down to Southeast Asia. But they're doing so in under very different cultural dynamics. So the avant-garde element in a lot of what I talk about in the 1920s, which is driven by the interest of people like Chechikov in exploring new forms, but also in ways of disorienting their audience that prove ultimately productive, right? So it's this kind of idea of employing forms of estrangement that can ultimately lead to the reconfiguration of consciousness. A lot of that is gone by the 50s, and the image of China that you have in Soviet culture at that time, I would say, is much more in accordance with a kind of sort of mainstream, really late Stalinist kind of Soviet patriotic culture. So there's a very famous song called Moscow Beijing, Moskva Pekin, which is a kind of upbeat march about how Moscow and Beijing will be friends forever. And the friendship of peoples and races is being strengthened by this union. A lot of these co-produced films that are getting made are in the genre of kind of optimistic socialist realist films about the construction of factories in China with Soviet assistance, or these expeditions that are strengthening the connection between the two. So I would say that the interest in these kinds of tensions over translation, over the authority to represent difference, a lot of that does get smoothed away in the 50s by a more kind of straightforwardly triumphant narrative. But I'm interested in seeing how behind the scenes, in terms of production, a lot of that stuff is still getting played out in the way that the Soviet and Chinese sides interact.
Right. Fascinating. There's also, of course, a lot of contemporary resonance for all of these questions in that Moscow and Peking are still marching together.
Right. right.
At least recently, in meetings between Xi Jinping and Putin, for instance, that took place just last week. There's one final question from chat, which asks about your reference earlier to Soviet interests in the Caucasus and in Turkey, and of course China. And the question is, are there similar dialogues with other regions across East Asia at the time?
Yeah, I would say there are. I mean, maybe not so much East Asia. China is kind of the focal point in East Asia, although also Japan, of course, plays a very important role in a lot of these interactions because a lot of what is reaching China in terms of translations of Soviet literature, translations of things like Russian revolutionary theory, the Russian populism of the 19th century. A lot of that is coming through Japan. And so, for example, in one part of the book, I talk about this ultimately unfinished cinematic collaboration between Boris Pinyak and the Chinese writer Tian Han, who actually goes on to write the words for the March of the Volunteers, the Chinese national anthem in the 30s, right? His knowledge about Russia came through his experience of being a student in Tokyo, where he learned about things like Russian populism. He read writers like Tolstoy, right, who was a very large influence, particularly on Chinese anarchists in the 20s. So Japan is definitely important too. And actually, the Great Flight that Schneiderov took after they reached Beijing, it split in two, and one part went to Tokyo and one part went to Shanghai. But there, the tension is more over, a rising sort of Japanese proletarian movement and Japanese proletarian literature, but also Japan as a potential military adversary, right? And that shifts more towards hostility in the 1930s. There's also a lot of really interesting things happening in terms of Soviet relationships with other parts of Asia. So Turkey is very important to this, Persia/Iran, Afghanistan and India. And these are things that other scholars than myself have written about. So Katerina Clark has a recent book that deals with some of the engagements with those areas, which expands the focus beyond China. Focused on China is, I think it remains both the most politically acute in terms of it's really the space where the chances of a successful revolution are, from the Soviet perspective, at the highest. And I think it is the space where this kind of experimental drive, this drive to sort of create new forms that can mediate this Sino-Chinese encounter, Sino-Russian encounter, is at its strongest. And in that way, this is part of a wider question of China's relationship to and China's place in European modernism, right? So China as also sort of provoking new forms for modernists like Ezra Pound, for example, right? Or Brecht's own writing about China and setting of several of his plays in China. And I very much see this Soviet engagement as part of that larger question, but driven in particular by this political imperative of actually creating some kind of contemporary relationship that can overcome the sense that although China is in fact a neighbor of the Soviet Union, there is still some sense of cultural and of political distance.
Right. So a search to find forms that will connect. Well, it looks like we're coming to the end of the hour. So I want to thank the audience for being here and sharing in this really illuminating conversation. And thank you, Edward, for a wonderful book and a wonderful talk. So
thank you so much, Andrew. It's been a real pleasure. Thanks for
it's been a pleasure.